Song Keifeng does not stay awake because an emperor orders it to. It stays awake because you, a night food seller with 7 portions and a sulking charcoal fire, have not closed. The next customer is uncertain. The fuel bill is not. If this kind of history genuinely helps your evening, you may like the video or subscribe. Tell me where you are listening and the local time there. Let the room grow dim, settle comfortably, and stay beside the brazier. 1 pot holds broth. The theatre crowds have thinned, and you must decide whether the small hours are worth more charcoal. You ease a narrow stick beneath the grey crust and expose a red seam. A breath through the vent wakes it, not dramatically, but enough to put a tremor through the water. Around you, the theatre crowds have thinned. Sandaled feet still pass in pairs, then singly, then not for a while. This is Keifeng in the late northern Song, when the capital is also a market city, and your ordinary goal is to keep heat, food and hope in the same proportion. Too much charcoal wastes cash. Too little sends a late customer elsewhere. The revived coal brightens one edge of the brazier before the center follows. Within the next quiet minute, nightlife remains grounded in fuel, balance, water, and limited attention. A document can name the practice, though the exact posture belongs only to cautious reconstruction. The task resumes, and the evidence becomes part of what the person carries. This detail returns the wider city to one person's reach. The person's goal stays clearly in view. The brazier offers no opinion, which is one of its less expensive qualities, and no reliable forecast either. The next bubble rises slowly, then disappears beneath the lid. The stall is a careful arrangement rather than a building. A board rests across 2 supports. Bowls sit mouth down under cloth. A lidded jar holds seasoning. Another holds counted coins, and a bucket of water waits where your foot will not find it in the dark. You know the inventory by touch. The records preserve vendors more readily by trade than by personal name. So this adult is a careful composite, built only from documented streets, foods, hours, and working conditions. You do not pause for that explanation. Every bowl, cord, jar, and coin has a fixed place within arm's reach. Seen from the working edge, the difference between rule and practice can be felt before it is explained. Evidence places the person among real conditions, without turning inference into recovered memory. The person returns to what can be controlled, which is never the whole city. Nothing larger is needed while this detail still requires attention. The next step follows without ceremony. You wipe the rim of the pot and listen for the first returning footsteps. A drum sounds from farther inside the city, marking a watch of the night. In an older capital, such a signal could mean that ward gates were shutting and ordinary movement between them was ending. Here it measures time, but it does not empty the food street. A porter crosses with an empty carrying pole. 2 men leave a wine house. A watchman passes beneath a lamp and looks at your fire before he looks at you. The city remains governed, watched and gated at its outer walls. The drum fades while a porter's pole continues across the open lane. In the narrow space around it, the larger system is present, but it never replaces the immediate task. No surviving source records this exact second, but the conditions around it are well supported. Attention drops from the city-wide change to the single thing that still needs doing. This detail makes the change visible without raising the voice. The explanation yields to ordinary effort, yet the lane itself keeps breathing after the drum, which is the practical difference on which your supper trade depends. Nobody decreed this night into existence. There was no single morning when an emperor announced that the city might remain awake. The old ward system eroded over generations as shops pressed toward street fronts. Stalls occupied useful corners, customers ignored older boundaries, and officials repeatedly found commerce easier to regulate than to erase. Rules and enforcement varied. Restrictions survived in places and at times. Still, the law increasingly followed the street. The old rule survives as memory, while the working street supplies the answer. For the person handling it, the practical cost of openness becomes clearer than any ornamental description. What survives establishes the urban habit. The precise gesture is kept plausible and low stakes. The task absorbs attention again, leaving the larger history present but not dominant. Around this detail, the scene keeps its practical center of gravity. The practical rhythm continues without display. You slide the lid aside, see the broth rolling again, and understand the change in the least ceremonial way possible. Your stall can sell food now because too many people are already outside to be put neatly back behind walls. The water has reached a proper boil, so you lower the fire instead of feeding it. The movement saves a little fuel and prevents the broth from reducing into something too salty to sell. Each remaining portion represents ingredients already bought, labor already spent, and money not yet recovered. You count again, though the answer has not changed. 7. A small business at 2 in the morning is partly cooking and partly weather forecasting with human beings. The sky is clear, the theatre doors are closing, and the wine houses still have lamps on their upper floors. A small lowering of the vent turns fierce heat into useful heat. Under the nearest lamp, urban history becomes a matter of placement, pressure, and consequence. The sources establish what could happen here, and uncertainty stays visible at the edges. The surrounding street returns to hearing, and the next choice arrives in its own time. This detail keeps the scene warm, weighted, and specific. No larger claim is placed upon it. None of those signs agrees completely with the others. A young clerk stops, pats his sleeves, and asks for a bowl with lean and fat pork, the sort of noodle order remembered in accounts of the capital's restaurants. You can offer noodles and broth, but the last slices of pork went to 3 customers who arrived together. He considers this as though it might be a personal failing on the part of history. You offer a wheat cake softened in the broth instead. He accepts, because hunger has a useful talent for revising a menu. The clerk bends over the steam and accepts the substitute without ceremony. Across this brief pause, the street's openness creates both an opportunity and another thing to manage. What is secure stays clear, and what is staged remains quiet, plausible, and consequence-free. The evidence has done its work, and the person's next movement completes the thought. A final glance toward this detail keeps the sequence physically clear. The quiet comes from completed movement. While he eats, you keep one hand near the vent and one eye on the dark mouth of the lane. The clerk leaves 2 coins and a little broth in the bowl. You rinse it with a measured splash rather than a generous one. Water must be carried, and anything carried acquires value before it reaches the stall. Across the lane, a seller is packing away skewers. Farther down, another pot is only just being set over fresh coals for the dawn trade. The night market and the early market do not meet at a clean line. They overlap through tired hands, borrowed flame, and carts that arrive before the previous shift has admitted defeat. Rinse water circles the bowl before returning as a smaller, clouded measure. At the level of hands and tools, the ordinary inconvenience keeps the historical claim from floating away. Written and material evidence secure the framework, not every private thought placed inside it. The scene settles back onto hands, weight, and the small remaining margin for error. This detail offers a modest endpoint before the next action. The work keeps its modest pace. Your own place in that overlap is 7 portions reduced to 6. Cold settles first into the fingers. You rub one thumb across the other, then wrap both hands around the ladle without touching the hot metal. The city described by later memory had markets that could run deep into the night and reopen toward dawn. That does not mean every stall stayed open without pause, nor that every lane did the same. It means enough trade persisted for a vendor to make this calculation at all. You bank one side of the charcoal, leaving a bright pocket beneath the pot. The damp cloth keeps the noodle bundles pliable through another interval. Inside the ordinary task, the night's promise is measured by what a tired adult can still carry or judge. The record carries us this far, and the scene refuses to pretend it carries us farther. One measured action closes the aside, and restores the person's ordinary goal. For this interval, this detail is enough to organize attention. Work resumes at an unforced pace. The fire now has 2 speeds, and so does the city. The next footsteps belong to a patrol. 4 men pass at an unhurried pace, carrying the authority of people who must notice smoke before smoke becomes a roof. Song capitals kept night watch, patrol posts, fire lookouts, and control over the main gates. Open markets did not mean an absence of rules. One guard glances at the bucket beside your stall and the clear space around the brazier. You shift a folded cloth farther from the heat before he needs to speak. The Empire has not abolished caution. The patrol's glance settles briefly on flame, bucket, eave, and cloth. With the street still moving, the scene keeps grandeur at a distance and lets labour remain visible. The known practice remains firm, and the unrecorded detail is kept ordinary enough to bear. The load, flame, bowl, or latch requires another decision before reflection can grow too large. This detail gives the evidence a plain and usable shape. The immediate problem remains enough. It has merely discovered that caution can walk among customers rather than sending all of them home. A gust moves along the street and presses smoke toward your face. You turn the brazier a fraction, using the stall board as a shield. Hanging signs knock softly above shop fronts. Lamps pull small shapes from the dark. A sleeve, a wheel rim, the pale underside of an awning. In Tang Chang'an, the great avenues and enclosed wards expressed a city that could be closed section by section. Kaifeng's street edge is more untidy and more useful. Doors, counters, benches, sheds, and stalls lean toward the road. Smoke slips under the awning and finds the vendor before it finds the sky. Beside the practical object, the city's new freedom feels useful only when the work can be completed. The source base carries the practical claim, not an invented certainty about a stranger's mind. Hands return to their place, and the city becomes practical once more. One more touch of this detail completes the immediate action. The person keeps working through the pause. The old geometry has met the excellent persistence of people who need to sell dinner. You hear laughter from an upper room of a wine house. Then the scrape of chairs being moved below. Multi-story buildings and upper-floor rooms appear in descriptions and depictions of Song urban streets, though no picture should be mistaken for an inventory. What matters to you is simpler. People upstairs eventually come downstairs, and people coming downstairs may want hot food. You add one small piece of charcoal. It catches slowly, glowing at the edge before the black center gives way. One coal catches slowly enough to make waiting feel like a purchase. During the small delay, a large transformation arrives through one adjustment made without applause. The evidence fixes the available objects and routines, not the unrecorded words between people. The person's hand moves again, and the story continues through consequence rather than commentary. This detail closes the interval without creating another question. Attention remains close to the object. The decision costs little, but it commits you to waiting long enough for the heat to matter. 2 customers arrive together, one steady and one leaning lightly on his companion. They ask for the same thing, which is fortunate because you no longer have enough variety to encourage imagination. You lower 2 portions into the pot. Steam rises into the lamp glow and briefly hides their faces. The street has become quieter, but it is not empty. The all-night city is not a continuous festival. 2 bowls cool at different speeds in the moving night air. In this measured interval, the market's endurance depends on repeated acts that look almost unimportant. Surviving descriptions provide the street and its work, while private motive is not overstated. A familiar object claims the foreground again and lowers the scene's intensity. Beside this detail, the historical point remains useful rather than grand. The action keeps its ordinary weight. It is a sequence of lulls connected by brief needs. A guard wanting warmth, a porter wanting salt, a clerk delaying the walk home, a friend making sure another friend eats something before attempting a doorway. The 2 bowls return nearly clean. 4 portions remain. You scrape the board, tie the cloth over the unused stack, and estimate the charcoal by weight in the scoop. The arithmetic is not written. Fuel, food, weather, and foot traffic have to be balanced in your head, then corrected by experience. The grand transition from enclosed wards to open streets becomes, at this hour, a choice between half a scoop and a full one. You choose half. Half a scoop of fuel becomes a wager on unseen footsteps. From one careful step away, public order and private need meet without either one disappearing. The historical boundary is respected even as the narration follows a useful human motion. The next practical choice completes the movement and opens no unnecessary question. This detail remains close enough to keep the movement grounded. The detail remains concrete and restrained. An imperial system can retreat by degrees, so can a charcoal pile. For a little while no one comes. The broth shifts under its lid. Somewhere a shutter closes. You sit on a low stool but keep your back straight enough to rise quickly. A city remembered through long lists of dishes and shops can sound inexhaustible. The person who wrote the richest account of Kaifeng, Meng Yuan Lao, wrote after the city was lost and he could no longer visit it. His record is superb, detailed and wistful. It remembers abundance. The memoir's abundance meets the stall's stubborn arithmetic. At the pace the work allows, the historical shift takes form in a hand, a threshold, and a finite supply. The source record gives the custom and surroundings, while this tiny hesitation stays modest staging. The next motion is quiet but causal, leaving no fact suspended without a human consequence. At this detail, explanation gives way to another ordinary decision. Nothing here requires a flourish. Your stall reminds us that abundance still had to be counted one portion at a time. The quiet gives you time to examine the noodles. 4 small bundles remain beneath a damp cloth. If they sit too long, edges dry and strands cling. If you cook them now, they must sell quickly. You separate each bundle with your fingertips and cover them again. A memoir may list what a street offered, but it cannot tell you the precise anxiety of this pot on this night. That part is careful staging, plausible and low stakes. The evidence gives you the street and the hours. Drying strands make time visible without any clock. Through the next simple action, commerce shows itself through effort instead of through a list of marvels. Material remains help with weight and form, while the momentary feeling is left deliberately plain. A modest adjustment carries the scene onward and lets novelty continue to fall. This detail holds the moment at an ordinary human scale. The surrounding night does not hurry it. Ordinary human thrift supplies the pause before your next decision. A man approaches from the direction of an entertainment quarter, carrying a small drum under one arm. Song cities had washi, pleasure precincts where crowds gathered for performance, food and drink. The exact buildings and ownership arrangements are debated, and the surviving evidence is largely textual. You need none of that settled before serving him. He asks what remains. You name noodles, broth and wheat cake. The drum player holds warmth first and food second, near enough to feel the weight. The surviving pattern is easiest to understand through the body's next decision. Texts and objects agree on possibility, while the scene avoids pretending to know more. The person answers with action, not a speech, and the larger pattern remains inside it. Everything important narrows again toward the waiting detail. The hands continue at their chosen speed. He chooses the cake because his fingers are too cold for chopsticks, a judgment that is both practical and beyond the reach of official history. He warms his palms above the bowl without touching it. You warn him once about the steam, then leave him to discover that patience has culinary uses. From his direction came audiences, workers, musicians, servants and sellers, not one undifferentiated crowd. Some performers were tied to registered musician households and state institutions, rather than living as carefree independent artists. The street's gaiety rested on labor and obligation as well as choice. He finishes, pays, and tucks the little drum closer under his coat. Service behind performance continues after applause has already dispersed. While the heat or load settles, the built city answers back through thresholds, loads, smoke, and uneven ground. Documented routine guides the scene, while imagination is limited to harmless movements between facts. The scene advances through a small consequence that no list of facts could replace. This detail leaves no room for a detached historical flourish. The scene lowers gently through action. You return the bowl to water while the coals settle. 3 portions remain. A cart enters the lane too early for comfort, its driver trying to reach a morning market before traffic thickens. One wheel catches against a stone, and the load tilts without falling. You stand long enough to make sure no basket is coming toward the brazier. The driver mutters at the wheel, the stone, and perhaps the urban transformation generally. He cannot turn easily because counters and awnings have narrowed the useful road. Shops that made the street lively also made it physically awkward. The stalled cart turns a commercial lane into a narrow workshop. Without leaving the human scale, the evidence matters because it changes what the person must do next. Modern interpretation explains the pattern, while the person's brief reaction remains carefully imagined. Another practical movement follows, keeping the person rather than the source at the center. No panorama is needed while this detail remains unresolved. The small consequence is allowed to stand. Prosperity has occupied both sides and left the cart the middle. When the cart moves on, its wheels leave a soft grinding sound behind. You check the bucket again. Fire is the constant shadow of a wooden, lamp-lit city. Kaifeng maintained patrols and fire stations, while Hangzhou later developed its own elaborate watch and response arrangements. The numbers in surviving accounts vary by source and period, so the essential point is organization rather than a boast about being first. Someone watched from towers, someone walked the lanes, and vendors were expected not to turn a meal into a neighborhood disaster. A bucket beside a brazier is humble evidence of organized caution. As the surrounding sounds thin, the next consequence follows from ordinary use, not from a dramatic decree. The framework is documented. The small bodily adjustment is an honest imaginative bridge. The next sound, touch, or weight brings the narration directly back to lived use. This detail carries the larger pattern without announcing it aloud. The evidence settles into lived use. You nudge one coal back inside the brazier. A woman carrying a wrapped parcel pauses and asks whether the broth is still hot. It is. She buys one bowl and eats standing, careful not to set down what she carries. You do not ask whether the parcel contains work, clothing, or food for someone else. The city at night contains errands that leave little trace. She notices the last 2 bundles and asks whether you will close soon. You say that depends on whether the street sends another customer. The parcel remains tucked beneath one elbow while broth disappears. Along the immediate threshold, the old order loosens in a movement small enough to miss from a palace. The evidence supplies the task, while timing and expression remain cautious connective tissue. Work resumes at once, carrying the evidence into the next ordinary result. Attention stays with this detail, where the consequence can be felt. One practical beat carries the sequence. This is true, but it gives the street rather more administrative responsibility than it has requested. The woman leaves, and the lamp beside your stall sputters. You trim the wick with a small tool, reducing smoke without losing the flame. Lamps made night trade visible, while signs and shop fronts turned streets into readable commercial space. Yet light was uneven. A bright doorway could be followed by a dark stretch where a porter tested each step. The open city did not become uniformly illuminated. It became a chain of usable pools. The lamp wick shortens, smoke clears, and the counter returns to view. In the space one body occupies, the city's complexity narrows to one workable problem and one available remedy. Texts anchor the action's possibility, but no claim is made for an invented personal biography. The immediate problem remains enough, so the scene moves onward without a larger flourish. This detail steadies the transition into the next quieter movement. The next movement stays deliberately plain. Your stall is one of them, no grander than a circle of light around two remaining portions. Another watch drum sounds. You know the sequence, but its authority has changed. It still orders guards, marks time, and links the night to official routines. It no longer means that every ordinary person must be sealed inside a residential ward. That shift happened through erosion, evasion, concession, and practical reorganization, not through one clean abolition. The sound travels above open counters and late bowls. You lift the lid at its final beat, and the broth answers with a small boil. The city's clock remains imperial. Another watch passes, measured above people who remain in motion. Before the next person passes, a remembered capital becomes credible through the limits placed on each person. Historical writing supports the consequence, not a falsely exact account of one anonymous life. A sound from the lane restores the immediate scale and draws the next action forward. A small adjustment at this detail keeps the story moving. The scene remains useful and human-sized. The city's bedtime has become negotiable. A boy appears, but he is not alone. His father follows a few steps behind, pushing a handcart with folded cloth. The father orders one portion and divides it, giving the larger share to the boy. We do not need to invent hardship to understand economy. Ready-cooked food could serve households and workers who lacked time, space, or reason to prepare a full meal at home. The pair eat quickly, then retie the cloth on the cart. You now have one portion left. The father divides the bowl before taking his own first bite. As the task finds its balance, the city's rhythm is made by overlapping duties rather than by constant excitement. The claim rests on documented patterns, with every intimate detail held at modest scale. The working rhythm takes over, allowing the explanation to recede behind the next step. This detail keeps cause and consequence within the same small space. The street supplies only what is needed. It is the most troublesome number because it can be sold, spoiled, eaten, or carried home, and each possibility seems sensible. You lift the final bundle. Its edges have begun to dry, though the center is still good. Cooking it now would save it from further decline, but an unsold cooked portion is harder to carry. Leaving it uncooked preserves options for a little longer. You set it down again. The title question has already reached its answer beside your hand. Kaifeng's food streets stayed open because commerce had escaped the enclosed ward, because customers kept moving after the drums, and because officials adapted to a city they could patrol more readily than they could reseal. The last bundle waits between sale, supper, spoilage, and home. At this close range, the wider change appears as a choice of timing rather than a proclamation. The documents support the setting and practice, while the exact glance remains restrained reconstruction. Then attention returns to the nearest object, because the work has not paused for explanation. For now, the nearest object gives the passage a quiet, workable measure. The task remains quietly in hand. Your stall exists at this hour because the wards no longer close, and in a small way stalls like yours helped make closing them impossible. The payoff does not make the decision easier. One bundle remains, and history offers no refund for spoilt noodles. You test the charcoal with the stick. Enough heat survives for one bowl if it comes soon. Beyond the stall, the lane has entered its flattest hour. Late revelers have mostly gone. Morning porters are not yet numerous. This hollow is where all-night trade proves itself. A festival can stay busy by excitement. The hollow hour is held together by separate needs rather than spectacle. Within the following still moment, nightlife remains grounded in fuel, equilibrium, water, and limited attention. A record can name the custom, though the precise gesture belongs only to careful staging. The record establishes the setting, then the work returns to the vendor's hands. The wide capital contracts again to one brazier, one pot, and one remaining portion. The person's aim stays plainly in view. A working street survives by having enough separate reasons for enough people to remain awake. A customer turns the corner, sees your light, and quickens his step. Then he stops at another stall first. You watch him buy something wrapped in paper and continue away. Competition is not an abstract market force when it walks past holding supper. Song accounts describe specialized shops and great variety, but variety also means that a customer can choose the next flame. You cover the noodles again, with perhaps more dignity than the situation deserves. A rival stall's paper parcel crosses the light and vanishes. Seen from the vendor's margin, the gap between regulation and custom is felt before it is explained. The record places the worker among supported circumstances without turning inference into recovered memory. The worker returns to what can be managed, which is never the entire capital. Nothing greater is needed while this point still requires notice. The following move proceeds without display. The charcoal contracts beneath a film of ash. Now comes the question of your own hunger. You have tasted broth during the night, but eaten no full portion. Cooking the last bundle for yourself converts possible revenue into a meal. Carrying it home may share it with another person, though it will not improve on the walk. Keeping the stall open costs charcoal. Closing costs the chance of one more sale. You look down the lane as far as the lamps allow. Hunger enters the calculation beside revenue and fuel. In the tight area around it, the greater order is visible, but it never replaces the current work. No surviving source records this precise moment, but the circumstances around it are well supported. Focus drops from the urban shift to the one matter that still needs handling. This point makes the shift clear without raising the tone. The larger history yields to the waiting ladle. A vendor's final customer is always easiest to imagine after the fire has gone out. You decide to wait through one more passing of the patrol. The choice creates a limit that the street did not provide. You arrange the bowls for closing without actually closing. Fold one cloth, loosen one knot, and leave the pot in place. Small rituals make uncertainty manageable. Around you, other traders use their own thresholds. The end of a wine jar, the last tray of cakes, the arrival of a relative, the cooling of oil. Folding cloth creates the feeling of closure before closure is chosen. For the worker handling it, the daily price of access becomes clearer than any decorative account. What survives establishes the city practice. The exact movement is kept credible and low stakes. The work absorbs notice again, leaving the greater pattern visible but not central. The scene keeps its center of gravity in the cloth, the portion, and the waiting street. The practical rhythm continues without display. The city may be open all night, but individual bodies and inventories still close by degrees. The patrol returns from the opposite direction. One guard recognizes the unchanged pot and raises his brows. You lift one finger to indicate the last portion. He does not buy it. Professional observation has limits. The men pass, checking doorways and looking upward toward eaves. Their presence keeps the story honest. This is not a lawless night. Outer gates remain controlled, watch systems continue, and authorities care intensely about fire and disorder. The patrol reads roof lines while the vendor reads the final portion. Under the closest lamp, urban history becomes a matter of position, strain, and result. The records establish what could happen here, and doubt stays clear at the margins. The nearby lane returns to hearing, and the next decision arrives in its own time. This point keeps the passage close, substantial, and particular. No greater assertion is placed upon it. What has loosened is the old attempt to confine ordinary urban life inside sealed wards and fixed market hours. You pour a little broth into a cup and drink it. The liquid is saltier now, reduced by hours above heat. You add a measured splash of water, bring it back to a brief boil, and taste again. The action prepares for a customer who may not come, but it also preserves the pot for your own meal. The line between business and household has narrowed to the width of a ladle. Shops opening directly onto streets made such boundaries visible and porous. Work faced the lane. A splash of fresh water restores the broth, but not the missing ingredients. Across this short interval, The street's access creates both an opening and another matter to manage. What is firm stays clear, and what is imagined remains still, credible, and consequence-free. The record has done its labour, and the person's coming movement completes the thought. A last look toward this point keeps the passage bodily clear. The quiet comes from completed motion. The lane entered the work. At last, footsteps approach with the particular speed of someone who fears a shutter. A porter arrives, sets down an empty pole, and asks for 2 portions. You tell him there is one. The eternal customer who comes just after the last portion is sold has arrived 1 minute early and improved nothing. He accepts the single bowl. You cook the bundle, stir it free, and add the remaining broth. He eats slowly enough to warm himself, while you let the charcoal fall. The porter sets down his pole with the relief of arriving before extinction. At the level of bowl and ladle, the shortage keeps the historical claim grounded. Recorded and object-based evidence secure the setting, not every inner thought placed inside it. The passage settles back onto hands, load, and the narrow remaining margin for error. The single bowl offers a quiet ending before the fire is banked. The labour keeps its quiet rhythm. There will be no second bowl, but there will be no waste. The porter returns the bowl and lifts his pole. You rinse, stack, cover, and count the coins by touch. The decision has resolved itself through a customer rather than wisdom, which is common in trade. You separate the live coals, spread ash over them, and leave only enough glow to heat wash water. The night market has not ended around you. Other lamps remain, and morning carts are beginning to appear. Your own stall, however, has reached its answer. Ash settles over the coals as coins settle into their counted total. Inside the daily work, the night's question is judged by what a weary worker can still carry or judge. The source carries us this far, without pretending it can carry us farther. One judged motion closes the explanation and restores the person's daily aim. For this moment, this point is enough to organize notice. Labor resumes at an even rhythm. Fuel and food have met almost exactly. A success too small for a court chronicle and large enough to matter. You tie the pot lid, wrap the bowls, and test the brazier once more. The last heat is banked safely beneath ash. Behind you, a shop door opens for the early trade as another closes from the late one. The 2 movements overlap without ceremony. No official voice declares that night has become morning. A street changes shift by shift, just as the ward system changed concession by concession. You lift the carrying pole. The carrying pole rises only after the remaining fire has been made safe. With the lane still moving, the passage keeps spectacle at a remove and lets work remain clear. The documented custom remains secure, and the unstated point is kept daily enough to bear. The burden, fire, dish, or fastening requires another choice before thought can grow too major. This point gives the record a simple and useful shape. The current difficulty remains enough. The title story ends not with a panorama, but with one adult deciding that the remaining charcoal belongs to tomorrow. You meet the street again from lower down, at the height of a carrying pole. The porter who bought your last bowl now has 2 baskets to move before the morning crowd thickens. His goal is not to admire Kaifeng's urban revolution. It is to deliver the load without cracking a jar, stepping into a drain, or being pinned between a cart and a shop counter. The commercial street opens directly before him. Doors face the road, awnings project above it, signs hang where a person can read the trade before reaching the threshold. The empty baskets pull unevenly until the shoulder pad is adjusted. Beside the carrying pole, the city's openness feels useful only when the delivery can be completed. The sources support the practical conclusion, not an imagined confidence about a stranger's thoughts. Hands return to the pole, and the town becomes working once more. One more adjustment completes the immediate action. The porter keeps working through the pause. The arrangement makes buying easier and walking more complicated. a fair summary of many successful cities. You settle one end of the pole, then the other, feeling for balance through the shoulder pad. The baskets hold small covered jars for a wine house, not enough to require a wagon, and too many to carry by hand. In the older ward pattern, residence and formal markets had been more sharply separated. Here workshops, houses, temples, food sellers and entertainment rooms stand near one another. Mixed use is not a modern label spoken in the lane. One chord is shortened by a finger's width and the whole load steadies. During the narrow pause, a large urban change appears through one adjustment made without notice. The evidence fixes the present things and habits, not the unstated speech between people. Your grip closes again, and the passage continues through consequence rather than explanation. This point closes the moment without creating another issue. Attention remains close to the load. It is the reason a porter can collect containers, pass 3 kinds of shop, and make a delivery without leaving the same crowded district. The first obstacle is a bench. It has migrated from a shop front into the public way, perhaps by inches over many evenings. Song descriptions and later scholarship note stalls, sheds, signs, tables, and working space pressing into streets. Officials sometimes tried to clear encroachments, but useful structures had a habit of returning. You turn sideways, lift the near basket, and pass. A city plan can grant a broad road. The bench yields no space until the porter changes the shape of his body. In this judged moment, the market's continuance depends on regular actions that look almost minor. Documented accounts provide the lane and its labor, while inner intention is not exaggerated. The wandering bench takes the foreground again, reducing the scene to balance and clearance. Beside this object, the historical point remains practical rather than large. The loaded pole keeps its ordinary pressure. A merchant can then discover that 2 extra feet of road would hold a very serviceable bench. Above the bench hangs a signboard, and beyond it a lamp. Commercial signs help a dense street announce its specialties. The details shown in paintings are suggestive rather than photographic proof. But texts also record streets identified with particular trades and establishments known by name. You do not need to read every board. Smell and sound perform much of the work. Warm grain comes from one doorway, fermented drink from another, hot oil from farther on. Signs, smells, and voices divide the street into readable trades. One careful step brings public order and the porter's need into the same narrow space. The historical boundary remains clear, while the narration follows a useful human movement. The subsequent working judgment completes the movement and opens no unnecessary uncertainty. This point remains near enough to keep the motion grounded. The point remains concrete and careful. Your destination is marked by a tall frontage and voices on an upper floor. The wine house occupies more than the ground level. Song urban accounts describe multi-story establishments, with guests above and service below. You reach the side entrance because the front is still occupied by departing customers and a man explaining at length that his sandal was innocent of the spill beside it. The doorkeeper points toward a narrow passage. The delivery passage hides behind the building's public face. At the rhythm the delivery allows, the urban shift takes form in a grip, a side entrance, and a finite load. The source record gives the winehouse practice and setting, while this pause remains cautious staging. The next movement is quiet but consequential, leaving no fact without a practical result. At this point, explanation gives way to another plain judgment. Nothing here requires a display. You lower the pole, guide the baskets through, and discover that an impressive building can still reserve its most awkward corner for deliveries. Inside the passage, a worker checks the seals on the jars. The entertainment economy of Kaifeng joined food, drink, performance, and lodging in close quarters. But the polished room depended on plain movements behind it. Containers arrived, water was carried, ash was removed, dishes were washed, and fuel came in from elsewhere. The street's brilliance rested on repeated loads. You wait while the worker counts twice. The upper floor answers with a chair scrape and a final burst of conversation. A crooked lid interrupts the smooth appearance of service. Through the following simple motion, commerce shows itself through work instead of through a list of marvels. Surviving remains help with pressure and form, while the brief impression is left plainly clear. A limited motion carries the scene ahead and lets sharpness continue to fall. This point holds the moment at a daily practical measure. The nearby night does not hurry it. One jar is rejected because its lid sits crooked. You retie the rejected jar and take it back onto the street. The load is lighter but less balanced. A carrying pole magnifies small inequalities. You shorten one cord, lengthen the other, and test the spring. Nearby, a group emerges from a performance precinct, the washi, whose name is glossed here once as a pleasure market. Surviving texts describe crowds, stages, food and drink. Though the exact architecture is less secure, the people disperse like roof tiles sliding from a pile, an explanation preserved in a later account. The pleasure market crowd opens and closes around the balanced baskets. Close enough to feel the load, the documented pattern becomes clear through the body's next call. Texts and objects support the option, while the passage avoids pretending to know more. The porter answers with motion, not a speech, and the wider structure remains inside it. Attention gathers again around the uneven load. The hands continue at their chosen speed. You step aside until their movement thins. Not every performer in that quarter worked freely for private profit. Scholarship on song drama warns against imagining a simple modern entertainment industry. Many players belong to registered musician households and served institutions connected to court, military, or local government. The nuance lasts only a moment in your walk. A flute case passes close to the basket, and you turn your shoulder to protect the jar. A flute case passes close enough to require one protective turn. While the heat or burden settles, the built capital answers outward through thresholds, loads, smoke, and uneven ground. Recorded practice directs the scene, while staging is confined to modest movements between records. The scene advances through a narrow result that no list of evidence could replace. This point leaves no room for a detached recorded display. The scene lowers gently through action. Evidence changes the human picture. Then the lane requires the next step. A fire watch patrol appears beneath a tower line that you can only partly see between roofs. Their work continues, because open streets increase the number of flames, lamps, cook fires, and tired hands. Kaifeng's government maintained patrol stations and organized fire response. Exact staffing figures belong to particular accounts and should not be turned into timeless totals. What remains clear is the routine. People watched, signaled, and moved toward danger. The patrol's route links lamps below with lookout points above, without leaving the lived size. The evidence matters because it affects what the porter must do next. Present-day reading describes the arrangement, while the person's short response remains cautiously reconstructed. Another practical movement follows, keeping the worker rather than the reard at the core. No panorama is needed while this point remains unresolved. The narrow result is allowed to stand. One patrolman checks a shutter latch while you wait behind a handcart. The handcart is stopped because a bundle has slipped into the wheel. Its owner kneels in the road, pulling at a knot that tightens whenever the cart shifts. You set down your pole and help brace the wheel. The bundle comes free without damage. No one gives a speech about civic cooperation. The cart owner nods. You lift your load, and both of you continue. A wheel is braced by hands that will not meet again. As the cart creaks onward, cooperation ends through ordinary use rather than through any formal command. The setting is recorded. The narrow bodily change is an honest, imaginative bridge. The following sound, movement, or load brings the voice straight back to lived use. The freed wheel carries the larger arrangement quietly. Historical evidence settles into the porter's resumed walk. In a lane narrowed by commerce, Strangers sometimes become temporary pieces of the same traffic mechanism. Rain begins as a sparse tapping on awnings. The first drops darken the dust without settling it. Shop workers pull goods inward and extend cloth where they can. Hangzhou's later paved streets drew praise from Marco Polo, because wet lowland ground could become difficult. But Kaifeng's own lanes also demanded attention in weather. You choose the center of the road, where wheels have pressed a firmer track. Rain chooses every loose board, awning seam, and hollow stone. Along the present threshold, the old order loosens in a motion narrow enough to miss from a palace. The record supplies the work, while hour and expression remain careful connective tissue. Your task resumes at once, carrying the historical point into the next wet step. Notice stays with this point, where the result can be felt. One careful pace carries the passage. Lamps blur on the damp surface, and the crooked jar swings with each careful pace. A shop opens directly onto the road, its threshold nearly level with your ankle. This openness is one of the defining changes from the enclosed walled city. The street is no longer merely a route between controlled compounds. It is a place of work, display, purchase, argument, and pause. A customer backs out while tying a parcel and nearly meets your basket. You stop in time. The open threshold creates both convenience and collision. Within the porter's reach, the city's crowding narrows to one manageable collision and one available escape. Texts secure the collision's possibility, but no private history is fabricated for the porter. The parcel and jar remain enough, so the scene moves onward without fanfare. This point steadies the transition into the following quieter motion. The next step stays deliberately simple. He apologizes to the jar rather than to you, which at least identifies the more fragile party. At a tea shop, a worker is hanging a fresh lantern while another takes down one burned low. Public nightlight was made from many private decisions. Authorities watched major spaces, but shop lamps created the practical chain by which customers and workers navigated. The flame does not abolish darkness. It gives the next doorway a location. A new lantern takes the place of one that has used its oil. Before the next person passes, a remembered city becomes credible through the edges placed on each person. Documented writing supports the outcome, not a falsely specific account of one unrecorded life. A jar's soft knock restores the immediate scale and draws your next action forward. A slight correction at this point keeps the story moving. The passage remains helpful and human scale. You pass from one pool of light to another, reading the road by thresholds, wet stones, and the pale chords of your own load. The lane widens near a temple frontage, then narrows again beside food sellers. Song streets gathered sacred, commercial, official, and residential buildings into proximity that would have been more strictly ordered in the earlier capital ideal. The temple gate is closed, but a cellar beside it is not. A kettle steams under a low roof. You consider stopping, remember the crooked jar, and continue. One late meal was enough to warm you. The temple frontage widens the lane for only a few useful steps. As the work finds its equilibrium, the city's pace is made by overlapping tasks, rather than by endless spectacle. The claim rests on recorded habits, with every close element held at quiet measure. The porter's pace takes over, and explanation recedes behind his next wet step. This point keeps cause and result within the same narrow area. The lane supplies only what is needed. A second would turn a delivery into a personal festival. A mounted messenger enters from a cross street, and everyone near the corner calculates distance at once. Patrols and attendants direct traffic in important areas, yet much order still comes from people yielding before they are asked. You press beneath an awning. A woman draws her child back by the sleeve. A cart driver holds his animal. The messenger passes, splashing only the first row of feet. The messenger's passing briefly rearranges every body at the corner. At this wet corner, urban change appears through people yielding before any official command. The texts support the surroundings and routine, while the particular movement remains limited inference. Then attention returns to the carrying pole, since the jars still require a steady shoulder. For now, the wet pole reduces the whole corner to balance and footing. The task remains quietly in hand. The street releases its breath and resumes in fragments. You reach the jar seller's workshop. It faces the road, with finished vessels stacked farther inside and coarse packing straw near the entrance. Song ceramic production ranged from plain utilitarian wares to refined objects now held in museums. A surviving bowl can establish material, glaze, dimensions and period. It cannot tell us whose fingers chipped its rim. The worker here examines the rejected lid, replaces it with another, and taps the fit with a knuckle. The replacement lid answers with a firmer note beneath the knuckle. Within the coming calm interval, nightlife remains grounded in fuel, measure, water, and limited attention. A text can name the routine, though the particular stance belongs only to restrained inference. The job resumes, and the record becomes part of what the porter carries. This feature returns the broader street to one person's reach. The person's purpose stays sharply in view. You lift the corrected jar and return immediately to traffic. The rain grows steadier. Water runs along covered drains where coverings remain in place and gathers in shallow hollows where they do not. Urban scholarship describes Song streets as crowded and sometimes constricted, with drainage built into the road edge. The system is useful until a board shifts or refuse catches. You test each dark patch with the toe before committing your weight. Drain covers turn the rain into a problem of placement. Seen from the practical side, the distinction between order and routine can be noticed before it is explained. The source places the porter among lived surroundings without turning inference into recreated memory. The adult returns to what can be handled, which is never the full street. Nothing broader is needed while this feature still requires care. The next action follows without fuss. The pole bends, jars answer with a soft knock, and your pace becomes the pace of the wet lane rather than your own. At the wine house, the doorkeeper has disappeared inside. You wait under the eave, keeping the baskets beyond the roof drip. Upper floor lamps are going out one by one. This is the descent after entertainment, when workers remain after guests leave. A cleaner carries a basin toward the rear. Another person folds a decorative screen. The street's apparent all-night ease is maintained by people whose tasks begin when pleasure ends. Workers extinguish upper lamps while service continues below. In the small room around it, the broader arrangement is visible, but it never replaces the present job. No surviving text records this exact weight beneath the eave, though its working conditions are well supported. Attention returns to the corrected jar awaiting acceptance. This feature makes the alteration plain without raising the volume. The explanation yields to ordinary effort. The corrected jar is accepted without comment, the highest form of praise available to a delivery. Your baskets are empty now, but the pole still catches gusts. You carry it low and turn toward home. Morning sellers are advancing against you with vegetables, fuel, water, and wrapped goods. The night lane changes direction without closing. In one shop, shutters come down. Across from it, a board is being set up. The overlap explains why sources can describe markets closing at one watch and reopening at another, while also giving an impression of continuous activity. Empty baskets meet full morning loads moving the opposite way. For the adult handling it, the physical burden of freedom becomes clearer than any embellished portrayal. What survives establishes the street pattern. The particular motion is kept reasonable and low stakes. The empty baskets absorb attention again, leaving the broader history present, but not dominant. The opposing baskets keep this passage centered on weight and direction. The porter's routine continues without ceremony. Different trades kept different hours, and the gaps were never identical everywhere. A fire lookout calls a routine signal. Nothing is burning. The call passes along and fades. This is the quiet reassurance of a rule still functioning in an open city. Night freedom was bounded by watch, gate, and obligation. Outer walls controlled entry, Officials guarded offices and important properties. Patrols watched for theft and flame. The change lay not in abandoning order, but in changing its object. A routine watch call confirms order without producing alarm. Under the nearby lantern, urban history becomes a matter of location, weight, and effect. The texts establish what could happen here, and ambiguity stays plain at the boundaries. The adjacent road returns to notice, and the coming option arrives in its own hour. This feature keeps the account human, balanced, and concrete. No broader conclusion is placed upon it. Instead of locking ordinary life behind ward gates, the state increasingly supervised life where it had gathered, on the street. Near the last corner, a wheel has sunk into a muddy break beside the road. The cart is loaded lightly, yet its owner cannot pull it free alone. You set the pole beneath the axle as a lever. Two others push. The wheel rises, slips, then finds the firmer track. Rain runs from your sleeve. The cart owner offers a ride, but there is no room that would improve your condition. The pole becomes a lever beneath a wheel, and then a burden again. Across this small delay, the street's freedom creates both a chance and another task to manage. What is certain stays clear, while the porter's exact thought remains restrained. The muddy wheel has made its point, and his next movement completes it. One final reach for the pole keeps the passage physical. Quiet arrives when the lever becomes a burden again. You take back the pole and choose the drier edge. The street story ends with footing rather than architecture. You place one sandal on a flat stone, the next on packed earth, and duck beneath a sign dripping steadily from one corner. Behind you, the wine house has gone dark. Ahead, a breakfast kettle brightens. The open street has carried jars, audiences, patrols, lamps, and carts through the same narrow space. A wet stone offers one secure step, not a general solution. At the level of sandal and stone, the ordinary inconvenience keeps the historical claim grounded. Documents and surviving objects secure the framework, not the porter's unrecorded thoughts. The scene settles onto a wet stone, a loaded shoulder, and little room for error. This element offers a plain rest before the subsequent action. The work keeps its plain measure. Its final demand is modest and absolute. Watch where you put your foot. By evening in a narrow residential lane, the household's older sister has one plain goal: bring supper home while it is still hot enough to be worth carrying. The room she shares with family opens behind a modest doorway, not a grand courtyard. A brazier waits inside, but fuel is scarce and nobody wishes to build a full cooking fire after work. Outside, prepared food is already available. Song descriptions note that some small commercial households bought cooked meals rather than making every dish at home. She pulls on her outer coat before the family can finish deciding who should go. That settles the debate more effectively than argument. The evidence supports the practice and the crowded lane. Her particular household is a careful composite. She checks the cloth for the bowls, counts the coins once, and leaves the doorway with 3 requests following her. One person wants noodles, one wants broth, and one child has developed a firm attachment to a wheat cake that may or may not still exist. The city has put supper within walking distance. It has not made ordering supper any simpler. You follow her as she wins the argument by putting on her outer coat before anyone else can become unavailable. The younger adult says noodles. One child has already requested cakes. The oldest person in the room wants hot broth and claims not to mind what is in it, a statement that will be tested upon delivery. She takes 2 lidded bowls and a cloth, then steps into the lane. Behind the shared wall, a neighbor moves a stool. The shared wall carries movement without revealing its whole cause. While the residential lane continues around her, household effort remains visible, and grandeur stays elsewhere. The attested routine remains clear, and the unknown feature is kept plain enough to bear. The weight, heat, cup, or bar requires another judgment before commentary can grow too broad. This feature gives the evidence a clear and workable shape. The present issue remains enough. Close walls make households audible to one another, without making them intimate. The lane is awake, but gentler than the main commercial street. A lamp hangs over one doorway. A small cellar works beneath another. Water carriers have made their last regular trips, and a household arriving late must use what sits in jars or fetch more. She checks the food stall first, because carrying supper and water together would make both tasks worse. The cellar offers noodles, wheat cakes, and a stewed dish named in the language of the stall rather than preserved for us with perfect certainty. Steam beneath the tied lid is the supper's diminishing clock. Beside the lidded bowl, the city's new openness feels useful only when the trip can be completed. The sources support this carrying errand, not a recovered transcript of the older sister's thoughts. Hands return to the cloth knot, and the street becomes physical once more. One more motion completes the nearby action. She keeps working through the pause. She chooses what the text securely supports. Prepared noodles and broth. The first bowl is filled. Steam fogs the lid before she ties it. Song ceramic vessels survive in museum collections in many qualities, from refined wares to sturdy forms. But an object record cannot prove that this exact family owned such a bowl. The scene therefore stays with ordinary glazed containers, suited to carrying food, without assigning a prized kiln product to a modest lane. A sturdy bowl is useful precisely because it need not be precious. During the pause, one tested knot makes the city's commercial change tangible without fanfare. The evidence fixes available vessels and routines, not unrecorded words between seller and customer. Her hand moves again, and the scene continues through result rather than explanation. This feature closes the span without creating another problem. Attention remains close to the tied bowls. She tests the knot, feels heat through the cloth, and asks for the second bowl. A customer behind her wants the last wheat cake. She had promised it to the child at home. The seller has only one, and the customer reached the counter first. There is no crisis, merely the domestic consequence of buying rather than cooking. She purchases an extra portion of noodles and decides that a cake can be divided only when it exists. The customer walks away chewing. The missing cake converts abundance into one child's disappointment. In this measured moment, the market's survival depends on successive tasks that look almost small. Remaining texts provide the road in its work, while personal purpose is not invented. The bare cake tray takes the foreground and lowers the scene's sharpness. Beside this feature, the past point remains practical rather than lofty. The warm bowls keep their ordinary weight. The city offers remarkable variety, but not necessarily the particular item requested by a person who stayed indoors. On the return walk, the bowls pull against opposite hands. Ready-cooked supper saves labor at the hearth, yet it creates its own work. Choosing, waiting, tying, carrying, and arriving before the heat escapes. She keeps close to the wall when a handcart passes. A lamp throws the cart's spokes across the plaster in moving bars. Two hot bowls make every passing cart suddenly relevant. From one careful action away, public order and unrecorded need meet without either one disappearing. The recorded boundary is respected even as the tone follows a grounded lived motion. Her next practical choice completes the movement without opening another question. This element remains adjacent enough to keep the movement grounded. The element remains concrete and modest. The lane beyond the household remains active, but activity is now heard as fragments rather than spectacle. One wheel, one call, one shutter. Inside, the child immediately asks where the cake is. She answers by opening the noodles, which is not an answer but has steam on its side. The brazier receives two small coals, enough to warm the room and keep the broth from cooling too quickly. Braziers allowed heat to be managed on a household scale, though their use also required ventilation and care. She sets the bowls away from bedding and loose cloth. Noodles replace the promised cake by the persuasive force of steam. At the pace of supper, the urban shift takes form in warm noodles, a doorway, and finite coals. The source text gives the routine and surroundings, While this small hesitation remains cautious staging, the coming motion is muted but consequential, leaving no detail suspended without a physical result. At this point, account gives way to another daily choice. Nothing here requires a fanfare. Fire safety begins at home long before a watchman sees smoke. The meal is divided by appetite and rank within the household, but not with mathematical calm. One adult wants less broth. The oldest person wants more. The child who requested cake discovers that noodles were the true objective all along. The older sister uses a ladle to settle the exchange. Prepared food from the street enters the household and becomes domestic again through serving, sharing, and complaint. The cellar provided portions. The water jar's lightness exposes tomorrow's task inside tonight's meal. Through the older sister's ladle, commerce becomes supper rather than a display of marvels. Surviving vessels help with weight and form, while the family moment remains deliberately plain. A held motion carries the scene ahead and lets newness continue to fall. The serving bowls hold the moment at an ordinary family scale. The outer night does not hurry it. The family turns them into supper. A glazed ewer stands near the wall for water. Surviving northern song-pouring vessels show the range of ceramic forms used for tea, wine, and other liquids. Though this household's vessel is kept plain in our staging, she pours a little water into each cup. The jar is lighter than expected. Someone must refill it before morning. The bucket leaves the doorway because an argument has consequences. Close enough to feel the lighter jar, the historical pattern becomes clear through the next household decision. Texts and objects support the possibility, while this interval avoids pretending to know more. The older sister answers by handing over the bucket, and the broader pattern remains inside that consequence. The household problem returns to the light water jar. Her hands continue at their chosen pace. The younger adult studies the floor with the concentration of a person hoping that water may replenish itself out of respect for fatigue. She assigns the water trip to the younger adult because he lost the supper argument. He takes a bucket and steps back outside. The shared lane reveals household labor in brief appearances. A neighbor tips wash water toward a drain. Another person shakes a cloth, and a door bar slides part-way into place while leaving room for someone not yet home. The city remains awake, but each room chooses its own degree of closure. Inside, the older sister lifts the quilts away from the brazier and checks that no loose edge hangs near the heat. Outside, the bucket knocks lightly against his knee. Written accounts establish dense lanes, carried water, fire precautions, and late movement. The exact sequence belongs to modest reconstruction. The consequence is ordinary and immediate. Because supper came from the street, the household saved fuel, but it still needs water, clean bowls, and a safe place for the coals. Doors, curtains, and shutters do not silence the public night. They give one family enough boundary to begin arranging its own. While the bucket is away, she shakes out the quilts. Textiles survive less readily than ceramic vessels, so no exact weave or pattern is claimed here. The action is simpler. Bedding must be placed, children gathered, and the warmest part of the room negotiated before the brazier cools. A laugh travels through the shared wall, followed by the scrape of a stool next door. She pauses, then tucks one quilt farther from the coals. The source record can establish domestic crowding and the materials around it, but not this woman's private thought. Her response remains small and plausible. She has a sleeping child, a limited patch of floor, and a neighbor whose evening is audible without being visible. The supper bowls wait for rinse water. A cellar calls once outside and receives no answer from this doorway. She folds the last quilt, presses it flat with both hands, and leaves a narrow path from the entrance to the water jar. The water carrier returns with a fuller bucket and wetter sandals. He pours into the storage jar without spilling much, then uses the final dipper to rinse the supper bowls. Water brought into a dense city room serves several tasks before it is discarded. The household does not possess an endless private supplier to tap. Carrying shapes every decision, from how thoroughly a bowl is rinsed to whether another pot should be heated. The covered brazier lets warmth remain without an open flame. As the nearby coals thin, the next consequence follows from ordinary household use rather than decree. The urban framework is documented. This small bodily adjustment remains an honest imaginative bridge. The bucket's final knock returns the narration to the family's lived routine. The rinsed bowl carries the wider habit without announcing it aloud. The account settles into lived use. He covers the jar and sets the bucket upside down. The brazier's heat has softened. She draws the coals together with tongs and places a pierced cover above them. The room is not silent. It receives the lane through timber, plaster, and roof tile. Footsteps approach, stop at another door, and continue. A late customer laughs at something beyond hearing. Farther away, a watch call marks the passage of time. None of those sounds requires the household to rise again. The open street has altered the evening by allowing trade and movement to continue, but the family still decides when its own lamp should be lowered. She checks the doorway, feels the latch settle, and returns to the brazier. This is where the large urban change becomes domestic, not in a proclamation, but in the difference between a lane that remains active and a room that may close itself. She draws the lamp wick down by a small degree. Street light stays outside. A red seam remains beneath the covered coals. One child sleeps first, turned toward the wall. The other listens for the food seller and asks whether people eat all night. She says that some people do, which is accurate enough for a tired room. Markets and stalls kept different schedules. Some closed during part of the night, others continued, and early trade began before every late seller had finished. Open all night describes available streets and overlapping hours, not one unbroken crowd or a universal timetable. The child accepts this answer because the next question is about the missing cake. She explains that the noodles were hot and the cake was gone. This produces a short silence, then a request for breakfast. The household's problem has narrowed from urban commerce to the edge of a quilt that will not stay tucked. She folds it beneath the child's shoulder, moves the lamp away from the bedding, and leaves tomorrow's cake to tomorrow. Outside, another set of footsteps crosses the lane and fades. The oldest person remembers a different lane from years before, though memory supplies no dates. A house had stood farther from the market, and supper required more planning. The family listens without turning the recollection into a lecture. Urban change is experienced unevenly. Proximity to cellars can save fuel and labor, while crowding brings noise, smoke, rent, and fire risk. The older sister checks the door latch. The door latch marks a private limit inside a public night. Before another footstep passes, the remembered lane becomes credible through the limits of this family's recollection. Historical writing supports the urban consequence, not a falsely exact biography for these composite residents. A sound from the passage restores the nearby scope and draws the subsequent action forward. A slight correction at the latch keeps the account moving. The scene remains practical and limited. Convenience and inconvenience have entered together. A pot from next door knocks against the shared wall. Everyone still awake pauses. No damage follows. The neighbor mutters an apology through the partition, and someone here answers. Dense urban housing creates tiny negotiations that official descriptions rarely record. The wall separates ownership, sleep, quarrels, and cooking, yet sound crosses freely. A neighbor's pot turns the wall into a brief conversation. As the household finds its rhythm, the city's pace emerges from shared walls and overlapping duties. The claim rests on documented patterns, while the neighbor's unseen evening remains modestly staged. Domestic rhythm takes over, while explanation recedes behind her small adjustment to the water jar. The shared wall keeps cause and outcome within the same slight interval. The lane supplies only what is needed. She moves the water jar an inch away from the plaster, not because it is threatened, but because the knock has made its position suddenly noticeable. She returns to the brazier and covers the remaining glow with ash. The household will need warmth again at dawn, so she preserves rather than extinguishes it. This mirrors the stallholder's earlier act on a smaller scale. Fuel is stored as heat, and heat is stored through judgment. The meal bought from the street has spared a larger cooking fire. Ash preserves the coal that tomorrow will need. Beside the covered brazier, the urban change appears through a household choice of timing. Texts support the domestic setting and custom, while her particular gesture remains restrained inference. Then care returns to the closest thing, because the work has not paused for remark. For now, the covered brazier gives the passage a calm, practical scale. The task remains quietly in hand. Its bowls are clean, its leftovers covered, and its only unresolved business is tomorrow's breakfast, which belongs to tomorrow. The lane continues outside while the room reaches its own ending. She places the lamp near the doorway, folds her outer coat beneath a headrest, and lies down beside the sleeping children. Wheels pass once, then not again for a while. A distant call reaches the shared wall as a softened shape. The household has not made the city quiet. The room settles by degrees while the lane continues beyond it. Within the final quiet interval, nightlife remains grounded in fuel, water, and limited attention. A source can name the routine, though the way she settles beside the children remains cautious reconstruction. The final task ends, and the evidence becomes part of the room she has arranged. The lane contracts again to one doorway, one lamp, and one sleeping room. Her ordinary goal stays clearly in view. It has made a small interior boundary within the city's wakefulness, and that is enough. To see how this ordinary night became possible, you step backward to Tang Chang'an. A ward keeper stands beside a gate as the evening signal approaches. The capital is organized into walled residential compounds called fang, meaning wards, with great avenues between them and principal markets in designated enclosures. At the drum or gong sequence, gates are meant to close and ordinary movement across the main streets is restricted. The system is never perfectly obeyed in every decade. Sellers work near its edges. Temples and powerful households create exceptions, and festivals can suspend normal rules. Even so, the intended order is visible in the keeper's task. He waits while a mule cart finishes crossing, watches the rear wheel clear the threshold, and begins to swing the gate leaves inward. The older capital assumes that movement after dark should be restricted and allowed only through exceptions. The gate does not explain every life behind it, but its wooden bar makes the principle physical. The cart clears. The keeper lowers the bar, checks the fastening, and leaves most residents inside their ward until morning. The keeper's goal is simple: to close on time without trapping a cart halfway through. A pastry seller near the gate serves people who arrive before opening or after closing. Evidence that even strict systems develop edges. Temples, high officials' residences, and exceptional occasions could follow different rules. Lantern festivals might suspend curfew. The point is not that Tang streets were lifeless, but that the capital's formal design treated night movement as something to confine and permit by exception. The bar falls into place after the final permitted crossing. Within the gatekeeper's reach, the larger ward system appears through one bar waiting to be lowered. No surviving source records this specific moment, but the surrounding conditions are well supported. Attention drops from the urban shift to the mule cart still crossing the threshold. The wooden bar makes the change clear without raising the tone. Explanation yields to the keeper's plain labor. The keeper waits for a mule to clear the threshold, then lowers the wooden bar. Over the later Tang centuries, that order becomes harder to sustain. Rebellion, weakened central authority, population movement, and expanding trade alter cities before the song is founded. Shops gather near gates. Informal markets appear. Walls and rules remain on paper longer than they remain equally effective on every street. There is no single instant when the old city disappears. A gate may still close while trade continues nearby. An official may order an obstruction removed and find it rebuilt. An awning removed by order can return when demand returns. For the official handling it, the practical consequence of commerce becomes clearer than any picturesque language. Surviving records establish the urban pattern. This particular action remains plausible and low stakes. The task absorbs focus again, leaving the wider change apparent but not primary. The returning awning keeps this passage centered on enforcement and demand. The physical sequence continues without ceremony. The change advances through practical breaches, each too small to look like an urban revolution from the doorway where it happens. When the Song court consolidates its rule and makes Kaifeng its northern capital, officials do not simply welcome disorder. They try to clear streets, protect ceremonial routes, and restore control where commerce has occupied public space. Yet Kaifeng depends on canals, workshops, taxes, food supply, and a population pressing within and beyond its walls. A stall removed today can return tomorrow, because the customers have not vanished with the awning. The state therefore meets the same practical fact again and again. Commerce is not merely entertainment. It feeds the capital and produces revenue. Scholarship on the changing cityscape describes this as gradual erosion rather than one clean abolition. Rules persist, enforcement varies, and officials sometimes push back. Still, mixed streets become harder to reverse. Imagine the ordered line of an avenue, interrupted by a counter that has reappeared after removal. An officer can point to the regulation. The shopkeeper can point to the waiting buyers. Administration slowly shifts toward clearing hazards, collecting dues, watching fires, and managing activity where it has already gathered. This is why the claim of one imperial abolition is misleading. A later date can mark a regulation, a relaxation, or a stage in legal recognition, that the physical and commercial transformation began earlier and remained uneven afterward. Ward walls decayed or lost their enclosing function. Portals sometimes survived as neighbourhood markers. Shop fronts opened onto roads. Market hours lengthened. Patrols replaced some functions once performed by locked internal gates. A regulation records one stage of change rather than creating all of it. Across this short interval, the open street creates both an opportunity and another duty to manage. What is secure stays visible, and what is staged remains still, credible, and consequence-free. The narrative has done its work, and the official's next motion completes the thought. A last look toward the reopened shopfront keeps the scene bodily clear. The quiet comes from completed action. Law followed a street already altered by use, rather than creating the whole change with one command. Men Yuan Lao provides the richest surviving literary walk through northern Song Kaifeng in the Dongjing Menghua Lu, the record of a dream of splendor in the eastern capital. He remembers food sellers, restaurants, festivals, performers, shops and markets with an appetite for detail that makes the streets feel crowded even on a quiet page. But the book is written after catastrophe, when the city he recalls is no longer open to him. Its lists a recollection, not an inspector's audit. That distinction matters. A named dish or late shop hour is precious evidence that such urban habits were remembered, yet memory can arrange abundance into a brighter pattern. Meng writes toward a place he has lost. The stallholder in our story does not know that future book. She only knows the pot, the fuel, and the customers who may still arrive. The memoir gives the street its documented possibilities. The anonymous vendor supplies no biography beyond careful staging. Wistfulness belongs to the writer. The final portion still belongs to the person deciding whether it will sell. In 1127, Jin forces take Kaifeng, and the northern Song court collapses. The event brings capture, loss, and displacement on a scale this quiet account will touch only once. Meng's nostalgia cannot be separated from that rupture. The dynasty continues in the south, and the court eventually establishes its capital at Linan, present-day Hangzhou. Kaifeng is not transferred intact. People, tastes, skills, and memories travel. But the new capital grows in a different landscape, around West Lake, canals, wet ground, and the southern end of major transport routes. For an ordinary newcomer, the first task is not to recreate a vanished northern street in every detail. It is to find lodging, water, work, and a route through a crowded southern city. The move south preserves some urban habits while changing their physical setting. A remembered bowl may return on another table. A familiar trade may face a canal rather than a broad northern road. The quieter continuity lies in practical needs carried by displaced people, then reshaped by Hangzhou's own river and lake country. Hangzhou's night has its own physical logic. Goods arrive by water as well as road. Bridges, quays, paved streets, and crowded buildings shape movement. Later accounts describe numerous markets, restaurants, bathhouses, entertainment precincts, and food sellers. Northern migrants contribute foods and habits, while local Zhejiang products and southern networks remain distinct. It is tempting to blend every attractive detail into one timeless Song city. Southern water, bridges, and local trade prevent Hangzhou from becoming Kaifeng twice. While Hangzhou's waterside street continues, labor remains visible and grandeur stays beyond the quay. The attested custom remains distinct, and the unknown feature is kept direct enough to bear. The burden, lamp, boat, or latch requires another judgment before explanation can grow too broad. The waterside lane gives the evidence a clear and practical shape. The present issue remains enough. The safer picture keeps the two capitals apart. Kaifeng belongs to the northern Song plain and canal system. Hangzhou belongs to the southern Song's waterside century. A boat worker in Hangzhou secures a small cargo at dusk, looping rope around a post worn smooth by repeated use. Her concern is the river level and the distance from quay to buyer. The street beyond is paved because rain and low ground can make unmade routes difficult. Marco Polo later praises the city's paving and waterways, though his numbers and superlatives require caution. She has no use for the compliment. Praise does not tighten a knot. She pulls the rope once, watches the bundle settle, and judges whether one carrier can take it across the bridge before the receiving shop closes its rear door. The southern capital's night trade depends on this quiet transfer between water and street. Boats deliver goods, porters lift them, shop workers wait, and lamps mark the usable edge of the quay. The sources support the setting and the practical sequence, not a private biography for this worker. She tests the knot a second time, shields the lamp with her shoulder, and signals that the bundle is ready to move. Night markets in southern Song Hangzhou continue the broader shift towards streets that serve residents, trade, and entertainment together. But the evidence comes through different texts, including later urban memoirs, such as the Mengliang Lu. These works have their own dates, purposes, and retrospective qualities. They name markets, foods, and pleasure precincts in a city denser and more vulnerable to fire. Watchtowers, soldiers, signals, and water supplies become essential parts of urban safety. A shielded lamp moves between quay, bridge, and receiving door. During the small delay, a large city transition appears through one change made without fanfare. The record fixes available objects and practices, not unrecorded words between workers. The boat worker adjusts the lamp again, and the passage continues through practical consequence rather than commentary. The shielded lamp closes the span without creating another problem. Care remains adjacent to the lamp. The boat worker passes a lookout and keeps her lamp shielded from the wind. The hand scroll called Qingming Shanghe Tu, along the river during the Qingming festival, offers a different kind of evidence. The Beijing Palace Museum attributes its celebrated silk version to Zhang Zeduan of the Northern Song, and identifies shops, travelers, carts, boats, a bridge, and a city gate. Scholars have debated its date, exact location, season, and meaning, and many later copies also exist. A painting shows what an artist chose to depict. It is not a photograph, a census, or proof that every lane looked the same. What it can do is hold several urban actions beside one another. A boat approaching a bridge, people negotiating traffic, sellers facing the road, and goods moving between river and street. Those painted choices agree with written evidence for a commercially active city, but they do not establish all-night hours by themselves. The scroll sharpens the question rather than settling every part of it. A painted cart remains a cart, awkwardly placed among people who still need to get past. What the scroll can do is sharpen questions. It shows open-fronted shops, mobile sellers, transport congestion, varied occupations, and the close meeting of river and road. Those images accord with written evidence for a commercially active street city. What it cannot do alone is establish all-night hours, identify a specific stallholder, or settle the full history of the ward system. The viewer must keep depiction beside document, neither forcing one to become the other. The depicted cart sharpens a question without answering every one. From one careful motion away, public order and unstated need meet without either one vanishing. The evidentiary boundary remains clear while the narration follows an ordinary human gesture. The viewer's next practical judgment completes the painted movement without opening another question. The painted cart remains adjacent enough to keep the action grounded. The element remains concrete and quiet. Then the painted cart returns to being a cart, awkwardly placed among people who need to get past it. Museum objects add still another scale of proof. A song bowl establishes that a particular form and fabric existed. A northern song ewer establishes a vessel made for pouring tea, wine, or other liquid. Such objects help keep hands, weight, rims, lids, and breakage in the story. They do not assign themselves to our household or stall. Archaeology and collections can anchor material possibility, while texts anchor named streets and practices. A bowl's surviving rim supports touch, weight, and scale, not ownership. At the pace the work allows, material history takes form in a grip, an entrance, and a finite supply. The museum record gives form and fabric, while the imagined grip remains cautious staging. The coming gesture is quiet but decisive, leaving no detail suspended without a physical outcome. At the bowl's rim, explanation gives way to another direct judgment. Nothing here requires a fanfare. Imagination may connect them only where the connection is ordinary, plausible, and clearly not a recovered biography. Dawn returns to the Kaifeng stall. You lower the carrying pole at home, uncover the banked coals, and find one red point alive beneath ash. The city has passed through its watches without becoming ungoverned, and through its markets without becoming one endless celebration. Its change came from accumulated uses. Sellers leaning toward roads, households buying meals, porters moving loads, audiences dispersing, officials clearing obstructions, collecting dues, watching fires, and trying again. Nobody decreed a night. Too many people made one. Law and administration learnt to follow a street that could no longer be neatly sealed. You draw two coals together and set a small pot above them. The evidence has already answered the title, so the action can remain ordinary. One vendor judges fuel against expected trade. One lamp goes pale before sunrise. One lane changes from late customers to early carts without waiting for an imperial voice to name the hour. The ember brightens. You leave the rest of the charcoal dry for later. You gather the coals, set water above them, and hear the morning drum. Once, a similar sound divided permitted movement from forbidden streets behind ward gates. Here it marks a time already being made by carts, kettles, watchmen, and vendors. The drum still matters, but it no longer tells the whole city when to sleep. 2 pieces of charcoal become the first measured act of dawn. The surviving pattern becomes clear through the body's next practical decision. Texts and surviving objects support the possibility, while the pause avoids pretending to know more. You answer by selecting 2 dry coals, and the larger urban system remains inside that measured act. The last explanation settles beside the waiting coals. Your fingers move at their familiar pace. You choose 2 pieces of charcoal for the first heat, leave the rest dry for later, and begin an ordinary morning with exactly the amount of fire you think the street will require. The charcoal rests beneath a soft cover of ash. A low red point holds without calling for attention. The pot is still. The ladle lies where it was placed. Beyond the small circle of heat, the lane has become a sequence of familiar shapes. A board, a doorway, a hanging lamp, the edge of an awning. Nothing needs to be counted now. A red point remains beneath ash without asking to be named. A little darkness gathers around the established glow, and no fresh task waits beyond it. The doorway, quilt, lane, and covered charcoal remain exactly within the images already carried. Nothing asks for an answer. Nothing is being moved toward another story. The quiet can stay concrete and complete. The last portion is gone. The bowls are stacked, and the cloth is tied. The lamp by the doorway burns lower. Its light reaches the threshold and stops. Inside, the quilt lies folded around sleeping shoulders. The shared wall keeps the room close, while the lane passes outside in softened traces. A wheel sound fades. A footstep crosses the light and leaves it. The doorway lamp touches the threshold and no farther. The lamp, doorway, quilt, lane, and river now share the same familiar stillness. Each has already had its place in the night's work. No additional arrival enters the light, and no unexplained sound needs attention. The known shapes can remain without being enlarged or interpreted. The brazier holds its remaining warmth beneath the cover. Farther away, the river carries a dim reflection from one lamp, then another. Rope rests against wood. A bridge stands in the dark without needing to be crossed. The water moves past the quay and under the night, joining no new destination. River light lengthens, breaks, and gathers again around dark water. The established forms soften without becoming different. Charcoal, lamp, lane, doorway, quilt, and river hold their places. The scene adds no destination, lesson, or promise. It leaves the familiar objects undisturbed, with the little reflected light allowed to loosen on the water. The lane, the doorway, and the river remain separate, yet each keeps the same patient rhythm of light, followed by shadow. The quilt settles, the lamp shortens, the charcoal gives one quiet shift beneath ash. Along the lane, doors are closed or open only by a narrow line. The familiar board beside the stall is empty. The bucket is covered. The carrying pole rests against the wall. Known household objects rest after carrying the night's work. The images already carried through the episode rest together. A low lamp, a narrow doorway, the quilt, the lane, the river, and banked charcoal stay complete. No movement needs to become a story now. The quiet belongs to objects whose work is already finished. All the small objects that held the night are now still enough to leave alone. Only the known images remain. Charcoal under ash, a lamp at a doorway, a lane beyond the threshold, a quilt inside, and the dark river carrying a little light. The fire is banked, the room is dim, the street may pass beyond hearing. The last glow holds while language withdraws from it. The last familiar glow narrows by itself. The lane is only the lane, the doorway only the doorway, and the quilt and river only remembered shapes. Nothing further enters. The covered fire remains beneath the final quiet, with no new word required of it. The final glow can remain without any further word.